Can you name me a North American locomotive class matching that description? If not, let me explain to you the German system for classifying locomotives. Or actually, the UIC system. The UIC being the International Union of Railways, as this system is used pretty much everywhere today, with two notable exceptions. These being the United Kingdom and North America. In particular, when it comes to steam locomotives, you might be familiar with the Whyte notation, which is very intuitive to understand, but with it also very unprecise as it doesn't pick up the smaller details of locomotive types, and also very inefficient, as a description using this system is often much longer than it actually needs to be. Two things, you know, the Germans absolutely can't stand. Therefore, they came up with their own system. And even though many people are scared by it, it is actually quite simple, at least when you start with the basics. While the Whyte notation uses only numbers, does the German system use numbers and letters. The major advantage of that is that we don't have to infer by the position of the number if those axles are driven or not, but rather uppercase letters stand for driving axles, while numbers stand for non-driving axles. In some rare cases you might find lowercase letters. These are booster axles. Obviously, if you find a lowercase o or a lowercase z, no locomotive has so many booster axles, that is something different, we will come back to that later. And that is a second major difference. Here we are counting axles and not individual wheels, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because usually on a locomotive one axle has two wheels. So keeping that in mind, we can translate a Pacific, a 462, to a 2C1. Of course, that notation here is incorrect, and that is because of the finer details the UIC system allows for. While you would assume that following or leading axles are part of a bogie, that doesn't always have to be that case. Therefore, a bogie has to be marked as such, and that is done by using an apostrophe behind the respective axle. So for most Pacifics, you would write 2 apostrophe C 1 apostrophe. However, the apostrophe doesn't really work if you have both powered and unpowered axles in the same bogie. For that you would use parentheses to group everything that belongs to a bogie, or to the same frame in the case of articulated locomotives. But as an articulated frame can have a bogie on its own, you can use an apostrophe inside parentheses. And with that you already know everything you need to know to describe the wheel arrangement of a conventional steam locomotive. However, there is more you can add to that. Let's maybe begin with modern traction locomotives. Generally the system is exactly the same, however there's one feature that most modern traction locomotives have, and that is that their powered axles are not linked together. So if you have multiple powered axles, which are driven by individual motors, which could also be a steam locomotive, just saying, then you put an lowercase o behind it. Technically this is supposed to be a subscript 0, but generally it has become common practice to just use a lowercase o as it's much easier when you want to vocalize your description to just add another letter to a letter than a number. You know, we could say B0 B0, but we could also just say Bobo or Kobo, or turn that around and call a locomotive Boko. You get the point. Of course, technically speaking, even with that, saying it is Bobo isn't correct as we are missing the apostrophes. It's just Bobo would be identical to Do for individually driven axle in one frame, but obviously we're talking about a locomotive with 2 bogies, so B0 apostrophe B0 apostrophe. Or Bo apostrophe Bo apostrophe Bobo. While you can get away saying it is Bobo, you definitely should not skimp on the apostrophes when writing it out. And if you find somewhere in there a Z, then that means you have a rack locomotive. But as the notation of cogwheels is very inconsistent, often they are not noted at all, I've opted to not go into further detail about that. But now is the point where I could just end this video, as now I've told you everything about wheel notation using the German system. However, you might have noticed all those weird letters behind the actual wheel arrangement. They also have meaning, of course. You can also find something similar with the Whyte notation, where you can find sometimes a T behind it indicating a tank locomotive, or even a PT indicating a pannier tank locomotive. While the UIC system does not differentiate between different types of tank locomotives, it does differentiate between a whole lot of other things. There are two blocks. The first tells you about the actual steam engine, while the second one about the locomotive type. For the steam engine, you will find either a lowercase h or a lowercase n, telling you if it's a superheated steam locomotive or a conventional one using saturated steam. H stands for the German term Heißdampf, literally hot steam, superheated, and N for Nassdampf, wet steam, saturated steam. As a small side note, wet steam and saturated steam are not the same thing. However, inside a locomotive's boiler, as soon as the saturated steam is collected, it practically becomes wet steam. So the naming for conventional locomotives just follows a different logic here. While in German they are referred to as wet, in English they are referred to as saturated. As practically, in that context, it's the same thing even though it's not. And very rarely, to make things even more confusing, you might find, instead of an N or an H, a T, which stands for Trockendampf, dry steam, which is saturated steam that has been further heated up so it becomes dry, avoiding corrosion, but is not yet hot enough to have all the benefits of superheated steam and is therefore not regarded as such. Then that letter is followed by a number telling you how many cylinders that steam locomotive has. And if you find a lowercase v behind it, then you have a compound locomotive, V short for the German term Verbund. And last but certainly not least, you might find an uppercase letter. G for a goods locomotive, P for a passenger locomotive, or S, German Schnellzug, for an express locomotive. And following that you might find your lowercase t, which stands for a tank locomotive. There are of course also many other special cases, like TURB for a turbine locomotive, FL for a fireless locomotive and stuff like that, but these are usually quite rare and in most cases you will be able from the context to tell what they mean. However, so far we have just talked about the locomotive itself. What if you also wanted to give some information about the tender? In case of a tender locomotive, and you can totally do that. You just add a plus and then continue with the wheel configuration of the tender, which in most cases would either be 3 or 2'2', and then a big T followed by the number of cubic meters of water the tender can take. And keep in mind, decimals are in German separated by a comma, not a full stop. Now, when it comes to modern traction locomotives, there are also many other things. Like what type of fuel they are using, what transmission they are using, what type of electricity they are using, all these kind of things. But once again, just with steam locomotives, usually you can't figure that out by using the context, but there are so many individual cases and I actually see them rarely used for modern traction locomotives that I put some on the screen, so feel free to pause, but there's no point in going through them one by one. And now you can also translate this weird string of letters and numbers from the start of the video and tell me what locomotive class I'm looking for. This video was a viewer suggestion. So if there's anything else about railways, and particularly German ones you want me to explain, leave a comment down below and maybe I will do so in the future. So thank you so much for joining me, and I also have to thank our Patreon and YouTube members, without whom all of that wouldn't even be possible. So thank you so much for your ever-increasing support. And now that we talked about wheel configuration, what about wheel size?